All right, so let's just kick into this episode.
Yeah.
Music of Antiquity is what we've named the episode.
Okay.
And we're covering the years approximately 1500 BC to 1000 BC.
Okay.
So 500 years. And we're going to start off with Vedic hymns. And from what I've researched and what I know, the Vedas are a large body of religious texts originating in ancient India, composed in Sanskrit. The texts constitute the oldest layer of Sanskrit literature and the oldest scriptures of Hinduism, around 1500 to 1200 BC. The sounds and now the Vedas, there's several books, kind of like the Old Testament and New Testament, and you put them together, it's called the Bible. Well, the Vedas there's one book and another book and another book.
Okay.
And so, and they were written with vast different time periods. And so the oldest one is called the Rig Veda. Hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And that was around 1500 BC.
Okay.
So it says that the sounds and texts of the Rig Veda have been orally transmitted since the second millennium BC. There's evidence that indicates the Rig Veda was composed in the northwest region of the Indian subcontinent, most likely between 1500 and 1000 BC, although a wider approximation of 1900 to 1200 has been given. Okay, so it's still within the ballpark of the time period we're listening to. So what I think is interesting is that they've been orally handed down, and so we may have a very close approximation of what they were singing at the time of 1500 BC.
That's pretty cool.
And so let's give that a listen too.
All right.
And that's
Pradaragnim pradarindram havamahe pradarmitravaluna pradarhasvina Pradarbhagam Bhushanam Brahmanaspadim Pratasomamudrudram Huvema Pradarjitam Bhagamugram Huvema Vayam Putramaditeryo Vidharta Adhraschityam Manyamanasturashchit Raja Ajityam Bhagam Bhakshityaha Bhagapranetar Bhagasatya Radho Bhagemam Dhiyamuda Vadadanna Bhagaprano Janaya Gobhirasvair Bhagapranravarnravantasyama Udedanim Bhagavantasyamodha Prabhitva Utamadhye Annam Udodita Makhavan Sudyasya Vayam Devanam Sumatau Syama Bhagayeva Bhagavang Astu Devastena Vayam Bhagavantasyama Tam tva bhagasarvaidyo haviti sano bhagapurayeta bhaveha samadvara yoshaso namandadadhikrave vachuchaye padaya arvajinam vasuvidam bhagannorathamiva avajina avahanto ashvavadirgomadirna ushaso viravati sadamuchandu bhadra Ghritam duhana vishwara pravita yuyam paada swastibhis sadanaha.
This is Rick, my name's Darren, and we're at episode ABCDE 5. Music of Antiquity. We're covering the years of 1500 BC to 1000 BC. These are probably pretty close to what people may have heard or may have sung in 1500 BC India, and the recording we're going to listen to is by Dr. Sambhajivan. I looked him up and I couldn't find anything about him, so I have nothing to share other than he sang some Vedas or chanted some Vedas, and that's what we're going to listen to.
All right.
Utteshtha brahmanaspate devayandastve mahe Upaprayandu maritas sudana vayindra prashurbha vasaja Tvamithi sahasas putramartya upabrute dhane hite Suvidyam marita asvasvyam dadhitayo va achake Praito brahmanaspati pradevye etu sunrata अच्छा वीरम् नद्यम् पङ्क्तिराधसम् देवा यज्ञम् नायन्तु नः यो बाघदे ददादिसूनरम् वसु सदत्ते अक्षीतिस्रवाः तस्मै श्रीलाम् वीरामायजामहे सुप्रदोर्तिमनेहसम् प्रनूनम् ब्रह्माणस्पतिर्मन्द्रम् वदत्युक्थम् यस्मिन्निन्द्रो वरुणो मित्रो अर्यमा देवा ओकांसि चक्रिरे तमिद्वोजेमा विदधेषु शम्भुवम् मन्द्रम् देवा अनेहसम् इमाम् च वाचम् प्रतिहर्यता नरो विश्वे त्वामावो अश्नवते को देवयन्तमश्नभज्जनम् को वृक्तबर्हिषम् प्रप्रदाश्वान् पस्याभिरस्थिताम् सर्वावत्क्षयम् दधे उपक्षत्रम् वृञ्जीदहन्तिराजभिर्भये चित्सुक्षितिम् दधे नास्य वर्तानतरुदामाः धनेनार्भे अस्ति वज्रिणाः.
So, what did you find out about the Rig Veda?
So it is the oldest religious text that's been in continual use, and from what I understand, these chants are part of family ceremonies and are often chanted at weddings. So to say that this is probably something that was heard in 2000 BC in India is probably accurate.
Mm-hmm. I agree. What I noticed listening to this is it supports the idea that music, particularly vocal music, began as elongated speech. And it makes sense that language would develop first,
Yes.
and then singing would come after that as far as linguistic singing. And then the more people began to speak and the more they stretched their words, a natural melody would form that's based on the contours of their language. And that's what this to me supports that theory or hypothesis.
Well, the only counterpoint I would have for that is the Bushmen, who would have developed a type of vocalized singing that's not necessarily of any type of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
They're using words or sounds as a melodic device. But I do think that the majority of vocalized singing, in particular religious chants, are the emanation of the beginning of written word, and then an almost ceremonial method of speaking the words. So you write the words and then you speak them in a particular way, and in this case a chant, or in other traditions you sort of sing a prayer, even in Christian traditions where in the Latin is sometimes sung in Catholic practice.
Right. I heard this is going a little bit over because you mentioned the Catholics. I heard that one of the reasons they sing the Mass in church is because the normal speech, the acoustics of the cathedral blurs the words. And so they deliberately elongate the words to help with comprehension.
Oh, okay. But for this, I do think it supports your theory about writing it first and then elongating it in a ceremonial way.
One interesting note is that when you are just speaking or reading the text, you're primarily using one half of your brain. Because there's one part of your brain that specializes in linguistics. But by singing the text, you're also activating the other side of the brain, which specializes in melody and musical intelligence. And so, therefore, you're getting both the brain that specializes in text and the brain that specializes in melody. When you're singing it, you're activating both hemispheres of the brain. So I think there's a functional benefit to chanting in it as opposed to just reciting.
That's interesting. I did not know that. And that, I think, whether that was intentional, and if it were, perhaps there's a lot more to be said about what ancient people knew. But if that is true, then I imagine that probably is part of the reason why these types of chants have stayed so long.
Right. They certainly have a long history. I mean, 1500 BC, and they're still utilizing the same chants.
Now, not being a Hindu, I have to say that I don't find this music particularly compelling.
Correct.
That
I would have to agree.
Yeah. That being said, it is fascinating to think that not much has changed between the original inscription of this music and what we've just listened to.
Well, it's kind of like our impressions. We had similar impressions with the Kilmartin sessions from last week in Scotland.
Yeah.
It's almost like these are archaic examples and also functional representations. They're not necessarily pleasing to the ear, but they have their place, and that's what I find this to be.
Yeah, I think I agree with that.
Well, let's move on to the Hurrian Hymn to Nakal, which was written in 1450 BC. The Hurrian Hymn to Nakal is the oldest surviving, substantially complete work of notated music in the world. I mean, that to me, and here we have it.
Right.
I mean, this should be on the front page of every newspaper, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
It should be required listening. Every third grader should be sat down and said, here is the oldest piece of notated music we have in the entire world, so shut up and listen.
It strikes me, though, to as a question, and I don't know if this came up in your research, but is the theoretical side of this music consistent with modern music theory in terms of structure, time, composition?
Let's give it a listen first. Maybe
Okay.
that'll answer our question.
Okay.
Okay, the title of that track is called The Hurrian Hymn to Nekal. It's also translated as a Zaluzi to the Gods.
Hmm.
Now, to answer your question, the educated guess I have is that in Greek music theory, ancient Greek music theory, they used 4-note scales. And I don't remember what they're called. I want to say tetrachord. But there are 4-note scales. And then the evolution of music theory is in the Western medieval ages, we took 2 4-note scales and put them together, and we come up with, well, originally the church modes, but then the scales.
Right.
And as I listened to this, it conformed to that. Even though the time signature may not necessarily have been 4/4, they would pluck 4 notes or sing 4 notes and then stop. Not different notes, mind you.
Right.
I mean, they would hang on one note, da 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 da, and then they'd move up, da da, and they would, once they completed 4 distinct notes, then there would be a break. And so I think they might be using a 4-note scale pattern.
And it does feel like there is a consistent tempo. I was trying to count, and it seemed pretty steady. So I do think that there are elements of modern music composition and modern music theory that are present in this ancient piece, which is also quite fascinating.
The tuning system for the lyre is described in the tablet. So they're not just telling you what notes to sing and the length of those notes, but they're teaching you how to tune the musical instrument in order to play the song correctly.
That's cool.
Yeah, that is really neat. We just determined it's a hymn to the goddess Nekal, who is the wife of the moon god. Which is interesting because in many mythological systems, the moon deity is feminine.
Yes.
And the solar deity is masculine. But here, there's in the Sumerian, they're saying that it's a moon god. And his wife is Nekal, so it's a hymn to Nekal.
And most often, I mean, the moon is either represented with, I mean, there's a few in multiple mythologies, either for a harvest, for agriculture. It could be for fertility and keeping with agriculture and things like that, but it could also be fertility for birthing children. And then, I can't remember, I think it's Diana in the Greek pantheon that is the moon goddess of the hunt, which is so more of a mischievous, mysterious, I don't think it's too much to do with fertility or bounty. So I'm wondering if if the wife of the moon god, there seems to me to be pretty heavy emphasis, and this is Babylon and Sumerian. It seems to be pretty heavy emphasis on relationships in the Sumerian text, at least from what I recall from last week, talking about the flood, some of the proverbs. There's the one about marriage, and then the other one about meeting a woman at a festival.
Yeah.
There's a pretty heavy emphasis on marriage, so I'm wondering if this hymn has something to do with fertility on the part of the woman to bear children. A hymn to the wife of the moon god to have bountiful children.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Something like that.
Good hypothesis. There are other tracks on this particular CD, and there are more hymns that are in the Hurrian language, which were found in a Sumerian Babylonian city-state called Ugarit, or Ugarit, Ugarit. if the Hymn to Nakal is the oldest substantially complete work of music, then what are these other tracks? These other tracks are fragments that are found that are partially destroyed songs, or they may be instructions on tuning but for a song that was lost. And so for posterity's sake, the musicians and musicologists who recorded the album recorded the fragments, so we get like a collection of some of the sounds that they were actually putting down on paper and some of the songs that they had intended to be heard. And so that's why none of these have survived except for the one Hurricane Hymn number 6.
Right.
And why is it the Hurricane Hymn as opposed to Ugarit? It was found in Ugarit, which is the name of the city-state. The people who lived there spoke a language called Hurrian, who were similar to the Hittites, and so they wrote a hymn to the goddess Nakal. So it's called the Hurrian hymn. Yet it was found in the city of Ugarit. The city of Ugarit says here that they sent tribute to Egypt at times. They maintained trade and diplomatic connections with Cyprus, and survived and lasted about 1450 BC to about 1200 when it was destroyed. And so that's why a lot of the songs were lost, and we only have fragments to all but one of them. And so we just heard number 19, a fragment of hymn number 19, and there was a pulse or a time. I'm not sure if that was imposed on it.
Oh, I see.
Because my knowledge, and we haven't gotten there yet, but my knowledge of medieval music is they don't have any bar lines, and they don't have any indications of the lengths of the or the tempo. But we impose that, we give it structure, or else we're not able to recreate it. So we use what we have with us now, and so I'm not sure if that was done here.
Well, I that would be something I'd be interested to know, but at least on this track that we heard, there was definitely a consistent tempo.
Yes.
And that it was as if there were a metronome in the back.
Yes, I agree. Although now I'm kind of arguing with myself on the inside. We do hear a lot of metronomic tempos happening with the primitive music that built up to here.
Yep.
So maybe it is just an extension of that.
Well, you would think that the first thing that music would start as is rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
You need to have a rhythm, and in order to have a rhythm, you need to have a tempo.
Mm-hmm. Right.
A consistent tempo, because if you start changing the tempo, you've changed the song.
Mm-hmm.
And in some modern music, you can change the tempo, but it's once the tempo changes, it's assumed that the previous movement has ended. But I'd be interested to know if that was actually if we imposed that tempo onto this, or if that was true to the written music. But
I don't know.
I was thinking as well that it's interesting that in this part of the world at this time in human history, they were both celebrating singers and musicians and maintaining their music in a sort of like the singers being present on tablets that were describing who was at the palace, and then also we have that they were preserving the music on tablets, not simply on parchment, or whatever they had used as like a primitive paper. So this was in essence the first recording of music.
Right. And like you said, they wanted it to last forever because they put it in stone.
They put it in stone.
Not just on a piece of paper.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. That's excellent.
I mean, I guess just overall, I don't particularly like this. It's interesting in that we've now taken the next step of musical evolution, which is composition, instead of like a chant that can be unique to the person who's chanting it, or something improved on a clay pot or a primitive drum. This seems to be composed
Right.
with very structured movements, whether it's on the, I think it's a heptonic scale or something like that, something similar to the Greek style, or if they had their own unique style. At any event, it's structured, which is not something that we've seen until this point.
And it brings up a different psychology.
Yes.
Because up until now, music has been improv, and then therefore there hasn't been a desire to recreate it perfectly.
Right.
Because the world changes, trees grow, trees die, the sun moves, the sun comes back, seasons change, and my desires move, my desires change, my emotions change, so the music I play is always going to change. So there's lots of spontaneity, there's lots of improvisation, but all of a sudden, boom, 1500 BC, wait, I want to make sure everybody plays this and sings it just this way.
Yep, and it's interesting because you imagine the person who may have wrote this piece and perhaps distributed it. Now there are hundreds of other musicians in this city that can play this music exactly as the person who wrote it.
And so it's no surprise that there are rock and roll stars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really cool. Moving on to Egypt. We're moving on to Egypt because we have in 1330 BC Tutankhamun. So 1330 is when King Tut became the pharaoh and started his reign. And at a young age, you said around 12.
Yeah, I'm pretty
years
sure
old
he was a child when he became king. I think he's colloquially known as the Boy King.
Yes. I'm aware of that. Now, when we listen to the Vedic hymns, the melodies are being passed down, the chants, the texts. So there's a close approximation that this is what they were singing. 1400, we have the hymn to Nakal. Now we have music scores permanently recorded in tablets. This is what they sang.
Hmm.
Here we're moving into Egypt. We're giving Egypt the spotlight. All of the ancient music from Egypt is lost. So now we're moving back to, we have their instruments. We know what their instruments sound like. Musicologists know from certain scales of the Mesopotamian, is that how you would say it?
Mesopotamian, yeah.
Mesopotamian area, what their music theory could sound like. So let's construct a ancient Egypt style song with the instruments that we have collected. And that's what we're hearing now on an album called Ankh, The Sound of Ancient Egypt, by Michael Atherton, who's an Australian musician, composer, academic, and author. And his liner notes bring the questions: what did the music sound like? How are the instruments tuned? Was the music polyphonic? One must proceed by conjecture and deduction, using the literal and visual record in conjunction with an examination of surviving instruments. The answer remains elusive, mainly gleaned from instruments housed in museums, along with iconographic and literary evidence. There is no surviving music notation nor any musical theory which might instruct one about the pitch, rhythm, and timbre of ancient music from Egypt. So you have to see this harp that he plays on one of the tracks. It's called the sambuca, which is interesting because we all know that as. But check this out.
It is cool.
It's like a boat.
Yeah.
It's a trireme almost. You know, it's a boat-shaped harp. And so that's one of the surviving instruments that's probably in a museum. He also has this other one called a trigon, which is a triangular shaped harp. Which
now that is interesting.
Which brings up mathematics.
I was just going there.
Right?
Yeah.
Not only the mathematics of music, but the mathematics of geometry.
Right. I mean, the Egyptians obviously had a pretty unique sense of, I would say, algebra.
Well, creating the pyramids,
right.
They certainly had...
There's a level of mathematical precision.
And engineering.
And they had an understanding of geometry, and from... I mean, I suppose it's a stretch to say that triangles are probably a pretty fascinating shape in Egyptian culture, given that pyramids are effectively three-dimensional triangles in a sense. But the structure of that instrument, I wonder if there was some unique math that it went into, and it stands to reason as well. I mean, a lot of people say that music and math are hand in hand. I mean, music is a mathematical representation.
Right.
Or
you listen to Bach and that stands out.
Right.
I mean, his music, when I listen to it, it's like listening to math problems.
Right. There's a musical element to math. Like music is a representation of mathematics, and so I'm wondering if, when they put that instrument together, if there was some unique mathematical, I don't know, equation or something that they were trying to figure out and came to this.
Create a physical representation.
Right.
I don't know. That would be a really interesting theory. What we can listen to M-A-A-T. Would you pronounce that Mott?
Or Ma'at.
Or Ma'at.
Like yeah. That's how I would say it.
Guess what we have in this particular piece? We not only have trumpets, but we have conch shells and ram's horns. So,
I did also notice the traditional, the stereotypical Egyptian flute or clarinet, whatever it is, or that you hear or commonly see of a man playing with a cobra coming out.
Right, in the basket. And it's got that wide open ending. It's tiny, thin, and it tapers down and it goes like a little bell at the end.
Yep.
subtitle is Truth, Balance, and Order.
Mm.
And the one thing that stands out for me is that he used all woodwind, they're not literally woodwinds, but breathing instruments, aerophones, as I believe what they're officially called, because you're blowing air into them. The conch shell, the ram's horn, the trumpets, and the reed flutes that we just heard in this last movement. I think indicative of not only early music but early musical instruments, they're very limited on the amount of pitches.
Yeah.
And so therefore that supports the idea that we had earlier that they had 4-note scales they were working with. And you heard that a lot. And so he really played around with 3 notes, and he improvised that with repeating patterns, and he changed it up a little bit to make it interesting, but there's not a lot of complexity, possibly due to the limitation of the instrument itself, which probably can't make a whole... You're not getting 88 key notes anymore, you're just getting 4 notes.
Right, and a reed flute is sort of like a recorder in that way. It's you can put the holes in it, and you're limited on what you can play with it. And I don't think they probably had the wherewithal to put the whatever it's called, the hole in the back that can change the pitch.
The octave.
Yeah, and so they are limited, and it strikes me as well while you were talking about that like you described earlier when we were talking about the Sumerian or the Babylonian music and describing it as being similar to Greek. Now I'm thinking, where did this derive? Because if the Babylonians had regular contact with Cyprus, Cyprus being part Greek, and the Greeks had regular contact with the Egyptians, and vice versa. And so who created this structure, this 4-note structure that we're seeing is commonplace throughout the Mediterranean music that we've been listening to that is contemporary?
Because it is a leap from the primitive music that we've been listening to.
Right.
Because the primitive music we've been listening to is indicative of rhythm, and it's indicative of imitating your environment, and it's also indicative of elongating your words. But now all of a sudden we're getting melodies that, where is the source coming from these melodies? They don't sound like they're trying to imitate birds.
Nope.
They don't sound like they're trying to imitate language. I think this is, you raise a really interesting question.
And I think it speaks to the sophisticated mathematics that they were starting to develop at this time, and maybe
that might be a product of it.
Starting to explore
the
math.
The music that is being what word am I looking for? Expressed. The music that's being expressed may be a direct influence from the math.
Yeah, and what probably happened is they may have noticed that these tones, these whatever, correspond to certain mathematical whatever it is, if it's a number or a wave. I don't know how sophisticated they were with that, but certain scholars certainly believe so. Maybe they just discovered that the link between music and math, and as they started playing with that, started figuring out, these notes...
And the cosmos.
Right, these notes fit together, and these notes fit together, and that's when you end up with a 4-note scale, which expands later as you described, and then once you have your 4-note scale, well, now it's just a matter of changing the order of the notes that you're playing. And in the first movement of this, with the drums, that's a constant tempo. That was
Yeah.
a constant tempo.
Yeah.
And so they're starting to figure out tempo, they're starting to figure out scaling, they're starting to figure out the composition, and they're putting that all together into, well, and this is, I think, it's a representation, but I think it's a fair representation
Right.
that this is now where we are, given what we heard from the Babylonians.
Yes, because our viewer may be saying, well, this is made up completely by the composer, so it's not really Egyptian music.
Right.
But on the other hand, when you have an instrument that you found is is dated during that time period, and you have only 3 strings,
Right.
then you can only make music with 3 strings, and so guess what? It's probably going to be pretty close to the Egyptian making music with 3 strings.
And the other fascinating thing is, if Egypt, and you said they were paying, the city of Ugarit was paying tribute to
Right.
Egypt,
They
it stands
influenced
to
one
reason
another.
that merchants from Egypt may have gone to Ugarit and seen the music that we're playing, bring
Right.
it back to Egypt,
Or even sold it.
or
to
even
them.
sold it or bought it, and maybe there's Babylonian music that's
Mhm.
been carved onto stones that was brought to
Yeah.
Egypt and destroyed at a certain point. Or,
Hey, you want to buy a song?
right.
Get the crane out because it's on a giant piece of stone.
Right, exactly. But I mean, it stands to reason that this musical composition started to spread as
Right, right.
as city-states were linking to each other,
Mhm.
and now you've got Egyptians that are taking the Babylonian composition and making it their own,
Right.
which is probably a result, effectively, what we've just listened to. And then with ancient Greek music as well, it's probably the same,
Mhm.
or at least sounds the same, with their own Greek spin to it.
Right. Let's listen to another piece. Ket. K-U-T-T.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Let's check this one out.
Yeah, so the track we just listened to is called Ket, which is a unit of measurement in ancient Egypt, and it's actually a unit of land measurement. It was originally a setat, was the basic unit of land measurement, may originally have varied in size across Egypt. It was later equal to 1 square ket, where a ket measured 100 cubits. And a cubit, they had a cubit rod, which I was reading earlier. I don't have the exact dimensions of a cubit rod, but it does break down similarly that we have how we have on rulers, inches and centimeters, etc. It's similar to that, where it's fingers, hands, shoulders, feet.
Which is interesting because the subtitle of Ket is the physical body.
Yeah.
So the unit of measurement, the physical body.
Right, and that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And you know, when you study what do they call it, sacred geometry, you find out that the human body is laid out in this geometric pattern like the golden ratio.
The Vitruvian Man.
Yeah, from your shoulder to your fingertips, the golden ratio is your elbow.
Mm.
And then from your hip to your toes, the golden ratio is your knee. And,
Yeah.
and you can find that in all over, even your fingers. You can find the golden ratio is this here, and et cetera, et cetera. And so it makes sense that they would find mathematics in music, and they would find mathematics in the structure of the human body.
Yeah, and apply mathematics and measurements of land. I mean, now this is a representation, of course, but it's interesting that the musician, the composer, chose to call it a ket. A ket is an actual unit of measurement.
The first movement, it just intrigued me because the composer decided to use water in the background for the first as an introduction, and it kind of brought me back to that. Remember, this is primitive music. Remember, this is music that, contrary to what I was saying earlier, that they probably relied a lot on their environment, the sounds of their environment, and so he incorporated that. And then the third movement we just listened to had a really catchy rhythm to it. Da 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 da. And again, it was short, only 3 notes, repeating that constant, but like a vamp,
Right.
In today's style, you know.
Right.
And so very catchy and had that stereotypical Egyptian sound to it. Na 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 na. That's very very Egyptian sounding.
With the percussion in the background, kind of keeping that tempo. Doom, 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 doom. You know. But I just thought it was that, particularly that third movement, was a really nice piece of music, even if it's not true representation of what ancient Egyptian music sounded like.
Right.
Perhaps, you never know.
I have one more in my notes. You got time for one more?
Yeah.
All right. Then we're going to listen to Shen. Okay, we just listened to Shen, subtitled Eternity, and two movements. The first movement, what stuck out for me, was that there's no melody. There wasn't even a rhythmic bass.
Right.
It was almost, he had a table full of percussion instruments that were found in an Egyptian tune. And what does this one sound like? Okay, what does this one sound like? Chicka chicka chicka. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what he was trying to get out, because Shen is it's a hieroglyph, literally means eternity.
Okay.
And so I imagine that what he's trying to get out of calling this piece Shen is some symbolic representation of endlessness. And so the first movement begins with like a rattling device, and then what was stuck out to me was that he strikes a bell and it stops. And then he strikes the bell again and it starts up again, and it's almost as if, in keeping with like musical composition, it was like an al-coda, go back to the beginning and start it again.
Okay.
In sort of a similar symbolic representation of eternity.
Okay.
It doesn't end, it just starts over, and around and around we go.
What hypothesis comes to my mind is that maybe the instruments he was using are eternal instruments. Like the bell is like an eternal instrument. Who's to say?
Right. But it was interesting then in the second movement that there's more of a rhythm.
Yeah.
And nice drums.
Yeah.
That, like you said, it has a nice pattern, a nice rhythmic pattern. That also has like not an al-coda, I wouldn't call it, but that one hit, boom, ba-da-doom, 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 you know, so it's like constantly driving.
And that drum was real unique. I mean, I don't think I've ever heard anything like that from a drum. It had a real fuzzy sound to it.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of electric guitars. Specifically fuzz guitars, like the Kinks. Have you ever heard the Kinks?
Oh yeah.
And their early albums. I remember watching a documentary, and the guitarist said that he took razor blades and sliced up his speakers, the front of the speakers, and to get that sound. And it has, and then he played it. It had a similar sound, or at least it reminded me of this fuzz drum that here we have the Egyptians getting it. And so again, probably there's an element of creating sounds to imitate nature, and nature, as I learned in my previous episodes when we're exploring sounds of nature, that nature often produces white noise. You get insects,
rain,
and then rain in the ocean. And so maybe they were trying to, in addition to imitating birds with flutes, maybe they were trying to get some of that white noise with the fuzz of the drum.
interesting you say that, because now it makes me think that that was the intention of the first movement, with that rattling kind of shh.
Right, yeah.
It's just a white noise.
Yeah.
And it brings me back. I keep coming back to the mathematics of it, but the golden ratio. I mean, the Egyptians had wherewithal of that as well. So if they were, they had that level of appreciation of nature, then it stands in my mind that your hypothesis of imitating white noise is a pretty high level thought process from an Egyptian, if their instruments were meant to try to do that. That's a high level thought process, that you've thought about the sounds of the undertones of nature across the elements, wind blowing on reeds, rain falling, the ocean, and then to derive that sound in an instrument that you're creating in much the same way that we were talking about the I don't remember what it was called, but the triangle harp. There's a high level thought process that goes into that,
right?
Which is pretty interesting to think about.
They're definitely on a rise in culture and intelligence and sophistication going on.
And I know I mentioned it last week, but when you brought up the time period that we're exploring now with Antiquity from 1500 to 1000, the
BC.
Stone Age, BC. The Stone Age was 40,000 to 10,000. Now we're in a 500-year period where, in that much time, we've gotten to musical composition and a diversity of instruments, and a scaling model. Now that we're writing something down, and
there's like an acceleration of technology
and repeating it by having it on stone, which is then, I guess, again, trading with other people, and now those cultures are being thrust into the civilized society, and now what are they going to do with it, which is going to accelerate the technology even more, because now there's more people exposed to it.
Right. Wow. I'm imagining those documentaries you see of the brain and the inside of the brain, and all the neural patterns starting to connect, and explosions over here, and then connecting and whatnot. I'm starting to imagine it happening in this area of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, gosh, I don't know when the Lighthouse of Alexandria was built or when it was destroyed, but I wonder how many pieces of music were actually in there.
Oh my God!
That might have been lost.
Yeah, their library is supposed to contain, or at least the theory or the rumor is that their library contained the secrets on how to build the pyramids and whatnot.
Right.
And so, sure, all of the music that they constructed were part of that as well.
And the other fascinating thing about ancient Egypt, and probably why we don't have any of their music like we do with the Babylonians, is that they, I think, if I could be wrong, I think maybe it could be the Chinese as well, but I think the Egyptians were among the first to use a primitive type of paper. Papyrus paper, right. And so, if it doesn't last, if they had written, if musical composition is something that they got from the ancient Babylonians by trade, it stands to reason that, the Egyptian musicians would start to write down their music, but because they wrote it on papyrus instead of carving it into stone, we've lost it.
Right. Very well could be. So, we explored
the Rig Veda.
We explored the Rig Veda, chanting of the Rig Veda.
The ancient India. We explored ancient Babylon again, the ancient Babylonian music.
In the first piece of music in its entirety that has been notated and preserved, the hymn to Nakal.
And now the ancient Egyptians.
And out of those, would you recommend any to a friend?
Interesting you say that. I have already recommended the ancient Egyptians to a friend.
Nice.
I was listening to it with some of my friends, and it was sort of like I had started listening to it, and I said, "You guys got to hear this." And sure enough, they did enjoy it. Now, this is a musical representation, of course, But if this was anything like ancient Egyptian music, I mean, I could see myself dancing to it at an ancient club.
Right.
Yeah, I would recommend the Babylonian to somebody who was a scholar and wanted to know, like, oh, what did the first piece of written music that we have record of sound like? Well, I can tell you.
Right. And bringing it up to him to Nakal, what would be the one word? I'm relying on your memory instead of playing it back. What would be the one word that represents the hymn to Nakal?
I guess really the best word that I can think of is organized. And again it comes back to we're now seeing the organized structure of music. You know, each of the movements had sections where the music would play, and if there was a chant over top of it, that would be over top of it as well, but it would stop and then it would start again. And so there's this organized structure, primitive as it is, around that piece of music. And so I would say that it's organized. And again, the first time that we've seen organized music in our exploration so far.
Which is a feat, and hopefully it's one that you enjoyed. We're going to end today's episode. Is there any last words?
Go listen to Ankh.
There you go.
Music of ancient Egypt. It's fantastic.
All right. Till next time.
Stay tuned.